Members, a quorum is present. We ask our guests and visitors in the rear of the chamber and in the gallery to please stand for the prayer. As part of the Assembly's observance of Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day, the day's prayer will be offered by our guest chaplain, Rabbi Julie Weiss of Congregation Or Ami in Calabasas, California. Rabbi Weiss?
Overwhelmed by the hundreds, no thousands, of shoes lining the walls of what is left of the Auschwitz concentration camp barracks, I turned to Sarah, a Holocaust survivor, on our trip. I said, Sarah, how can you keep touring this awful place filled with moments of terror and fear? And I will never forget when she looked up at me, standing next to the barrack she slept in for months while starved and exhausted. Julia, honey, those shoes you saw of all the victims, well, remember that my shoes are there too. Remember, such a simple request, yet so difficult for us to achieve. I fear that we've become numb to the horrors of the Holocaust. Modern life has forced us to confront violence and terror on a global scale, even reaching into our beloved state, the anti-Semitic act of violence that just happened a few days ago. We witness the demonization of the other on a nearly daily basis. Civil discourse and compromise have all but disappeared from public and private life. But today's ceremony in this distinguished assembly gives me hope. Hope that there are those among our political leadership who understand that we can, no, that we must remember the lessons of the Holocaust. That treating thy neighbor as thyself is the universal theme of all the world's religions, not just limited to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and certainly not just limited to the Jews, Christians, and Muslims who practice their beliefs exactly as I do. As my colleague, Rabbi Sharon Brous teaches, hope is not naive, and hope is not an opiate. Hope may be the single greatest act of defiance against a politics of pessimism and against a culture of despair. And so I invite you to join me in a prayer of defiance. Holy One of blessing, may you instill within us the ability to fight against our pessimism and despair, even as we remember. To see the shoes, and even when we see them, to recognize that it is within each of us to ensure that the horrors of the Holocaust are never repeated. Give strength to the survivors among us today, that they may continue to serve as reminders of the work before us for years to come. Help us to find hope, and let that hope guide the hands of those who lead this great state, so that we can continue to be a light unto the nations and to this nation. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will. Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi. Members, we are now going to move to the Assembly observance of the Holocaust Memorial Day. I'd ask that you please take your seats for the ceremony. Again, members, I'd ask that you please take your seats for the Holocaust Memorial Day ceremony. Mr. Gabriel, are you ready to proceed on file item 141? Moving to file item 141, ACR 54, the clerk will read.
Assembly Concurrent Resolution 54 by Assemblymember Gabriel and others relative to California Holocaust Memorial Day.
Mr. Gabriel, you may open on ACR 54.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus to present ACR 54 in honor of Holocaust Remembrance Day. Today, we temporarily set aside our usual legislative business to recall the horrors of the Holocaust, to honor the memory of its victims, and to recognize the survivors. Today, we grieve for all victims of the Holocaust, which includes not only Jews, but also Roma, people with disabilities, gay people, and political opponents of the Nazi regime. At the same time, we must recognize that the Holocaust was, first and foremost, an effort to destroy the Jewish people, to erase us from history. The hallmarks of the Holocaust were extraordinary efficiency, incredible brutality, shocking silence, and painful complicity. In a few short years, the Nazis murdered 6 million Jews, including 1 million Jewish children, and decimated European Jewry. At every conceivable opportunity, the Nazis sought to humiliate and dehumanize Jews, to deprive the victims of their identity and their dignity, and to prove the supposed racial inferiority of the Jewish people. In many communities where Jews had lived for centuries, their neighbors stood by silently or eagerly collaborated with the Nazis, enthusiastically assisting with the identification and murder of their Jewish neighbors and colleagues. And so today, as we do every year, we pause and remember the Holocaust. We must remember it because the temptation to ignore it is overwhelming. After all, it's uncomfortable to think about the Holocaust, to imagine families packed tightly into cattle cars, or mothers with infants being shoved into gas chambers, to explain mobile killing squads and death marches and mass starvation, to think about children and old people who were locked inside synagogues and burned alive, to imagine the smoke and ashes from the crematoria. Yet we must make ourselves uncomfortable because the memory is our best tool to ensure that nothing like the Holocaust ever happens again. We must also remember the Holocaust because in too many places, including in our own country, it is fading from memory. Recent polls suggest that 50% of Americans lack basic knowledge about the Holocaust, and 20% of millennials have never even heard of it. This year, we remember the Holocaust against the backdrop of a dramatic surge in anti-Semitic incidents in the US and around the globe. Just 2 days ago, in our own state, we witnessed yet another act of violent anti-Semitism, a tragic shooting that fell on the 6-month anniversary of the killing of 11 worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. In between these deadly attacks, the California Jewish community has endured a series of anti-Semitic incidents and been alarmed by the infusion of anti-Semitism into our political discourse. As we reflect on these incidents, it is important that we acknowledge that the Holocaust didn't happen overnight. It did not begin with gas chambers and death marches. It began with words and deeds of a much more modest nature, with hateful rhetoric and pervasive racism and discriminatory laws, with a democratic election that brought Hitler to power, with propaganda that convinced a highly educated and enlightened society, the nation of Beethoven and Bach, to embrace a campaign of mass murder. We must remind ourselves of the trajectory of genocide and recall that hate speech and seemingly isolated acts of violence can quickly escalate. And so today, we respectfully request your support for ACR 54. To demonstrate that Californians of all backgrounds will stand together to recall the horrors of the Holocaust, to teach its universal lessons to our children, and to forcefully and unequivocally condemn anti-Semitism, bigotry, and hatred of all forms. I respectfully request your aye vote.
Thank you, Mr. Gabriel. Ms. Kamlager-Dove, you are recognized on this resolution.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On behalf of the California Legislative Black Caucus, I rise in support of ACR 54, which recognizes today as California Holocaust Memorial Day. The purpose of this solemn occasion is to apply lessons from the past to current events. During the Nazi regime, Hitler sowed hate through his discriminatory language, creating prejudice and intolerance against Jews and other persecuted people, resulting in the deaths of 8 million men, women, and children, more than the populations of Los Angeles, San Diego, San Jose, and San Francisco combined. Holocaust Remembrance Day calls on all of us, whether Christian or Muslim, black or white, from Berkeley to Bakersfield, to recognize the evils of racism and xenophobia, and serves as a reminder for how even the most advanced societies can descend into darkness. It is appropriate to mention recent events while speaking to this resolution. Shootings in Poway and attacks on mosques in Sunnyvale should never be condoned or even allowed. But if we are going to advance and heal, we must come to reckoning with our history in this country. What is old often comes back in style, but eugenics and shoulder pads are not the same. We are living 2019 style, what our country sowed over 100 years ago when we passed the Immigration Act of 1924. Its primary focus was to protect white purity and keep immigrants out, including Jews. Hitler used our Immigration Act as part of his playbook for his rhetoric and his regime, and he studied how we dealt with integration. And now, in 2019, we see Muslims and Jews slaughtered in their houses of worship. We see African Americans purged through our social systems. And we see people from Mexico and Central America denied asylum. Our history is not pretty, but our present is becoming equally dark. Standing against bigotry doesn't necessarily require the same risks faced by those who hid Jews in their homes or those who printed and distributed anti-Nazi propaganda. It does require us to live in a way in which we've learned from our past by working together to preserve freedom for all faiths, offer haven for victims of persecution, confront bias, hatred, and violence in all its forms, and spread messages of love, acceptance, and understanding. By taking a stand, is it about protecting a master race, or is it about respecting a diverse democracy? We may disagree on a lot of things. We may disagree on a lot of important things, but we should all agree that you should never be gunned down in your house of worship. The Torah teaches us, Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice, you shall pursue. For these reasons, the California Legislative Black Caucus urges your aye vote on ACR 54.
Thank you, Ms. Kamlager-Dove. Mr. Medina, you are recognized on this resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. I rise today on behalf of the California Legislative Latino Caucus in support of ACR 54. Throughout history, Jews have been subjected to unwarranted persecution, leading to an attempted mass extermination in the Holocaust. We know from our own experience that we must build coalitions with other communities and support one another to fight our way out of oppression. Today, as we commemorate the unimaginable evil of the Holocaust, we also recognize those who were brave enough to defy Hitler's regime and protect Jews and others targeted by Nazis. Gilberto Bosques Sadavid, a Mexican diplomat, rescued Jews through issuing visas to Mexico. He helped save the lives of tens of thousands of Jews. We remember and honor him and all those who risked their lives to help others during the Holocaust. We must not let history repeat itself. We live in a time of newly vitalized white nationalism, which manifests itself as racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. When we stand together, we are stronger in the fight against forces that target Latino and Jewish communities. As we remember the violence of the Holocaust, we reaffirm our commitment to solidarity with the Jewish community and vow to reject all forms of hatred and bigotry to prevent the persecution of all people in the future. I urge an aye vote on ACR 54.
Thank you, Mr. Medina. Mr. Levine, you are recognized on this resolution.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker and members. I rise in support of ACR 54. We just finished the holiday Passover, which the Torah instructs us to tell that story to our children. And the Haggadah actually means the telling, which is the book that we read at a Passover Seder. And when we do this every year with our children, and we're talking about, what is the connection of Passover when the Jews were slaves in Egypt with today? And I think about something else that I had to tell my children about this weekend, the second time in the past 6 months that I had to share with them as I was going to synagogue with them that Jews were killed and shot at synagogue, but we're going to be safe. And that's the best I can put into it for my kids. And they trust me. And we go to synagogue. And it's extraordinarily challenging, as you know, to tell your children something, to hope for the best for them, and to have to live with the scourge of anti-Semitism, which is alive here in California. And that is why on Yom HaShoah, we observe that day every year, and why I am grateful that the Assembly observes the Holocaust Remembrance Ceremony every year. This isn't something that began 8 decades ago in Germany. This isn't something so distant. It's not far away. It's something that lives with us today, something that we've experienced this weekend, anti-Semitism. Why it's so important for us to mark that each year and tell people. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about the stories of some of the children who were killed during the Holocaust. Permission to use a prop, Madam Speaker. This is Jetty Pront, a Dutch Jewish girl. She was 10 years old when she was torn from her parents and sent to Auschwitz and murdered on the 28th of January, 1944. This is Carla Betty Van Baren. She was killed when she was only 3 years old. She also was from the Netherlands. She was killed on the 17th of September, 1942. This is Francis Levin. He was from Paris. He was killed on the 25th of November, 1943 at Auschwitz. These are just 3 of the million children that were taken from their parents and killed because they were guilty of being Jewish. My colleague from the San Fernando Valley talked about how people don't remember the Holocaust or know what the Holocaust is or can't tell you what Auschwitz was, that it was a death camp set up by the Nazis in Poland to kill all of Europe's Jewry. It's 80 years since 1939. There are fewer Jews in the world today than there were in 1939. We have not recovered from the Holocaust. And so there are a few things that we can do and make sure that people know about this, particularly for younger generations that aren't getting this information. And the photos that I had, Auschwitz and Yad Vashem, the Auschwitz Museum and Yad Vashem have Twitter accounts where they actually post this information. And there is a new series coming out on Instagram, and I usually tell children, don't pay attention to social media. There's an account, eva.stories on Instagram. Historians found a diary of a girl who died in the Holocaust named Eva. And one of her wishes written in that diary was to have a camera. She wanted to document what was occurring around her, from the life that she enjoyed being part of the middle class in Europe to the Nazis coming into their town, being forced into a ghetto, being taken to a death camp. And the historians found this diary, and they decided to put a smartphone in her hands. And on that Instagram account, they have documented this girl's life as if she was able to document it on social media the way so many young people document their lives on social media. And I encourage you to check this out, eva.stories, and to share with others so that they too can learn about the Holocaust. Members, thank you so much for marking this day together.
Thank you, Mr. Levine. Ms. Waldron, you are recognized on this resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Holocaust Remembrance Day is much more than a ceremony to recognize survivors of history's most terrible genocide. It's a time to remember the horrors that occurred, but also a time to dedicate ourselves to ensuring that it never happens again. We were reminded of the importance of this just 2 days ago in San Diego, when a man driven by hate attacked the Shabbat of Poway Synagogue on the last day of Passover, killing one woman and wounding 3 other worshipers. This horrific act of violence showed us that hate and anti-Semitism have not gone away in the decades since the Holocaust. Unfortunately, as there are fewer first-hand witnesses to the Holocaust each year, our collective memory of these events may be fading. Last year, a survey showed that 31% of all Americans and 41% of millennials believed that substantially less than 6 million Jews were killed. Half of millennials cannot name a single concentration camp. Today, we commit ourselves to not only remembering the victims, but fighting the hatred and anti-Semitism that allowed the Holocaust to take place. We must root out hate in our communities and do all we can to prevent it from gaining a foothold. And we must teach future generations about the horrors of the Holocaust to prevent them from ever happening again. That is the true meaning of Holocaust Remembrance Day. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Waldron. Mr. Nazarian, you are recognized on this resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to also thank my colleague from West San Fernando Valley for bringing this very important measure that continues to burn the eternal flame in memory of those that we have lost, as well as my colleague from Marin, who so succinctly and aptly shown 3 pictures of the 6 million so that we don't think about it in just statistics, because that's what happens. It dehumanizes when you just talk about issues in the context of numbers. So I thank you very much for bringing those 3 pictures forward. Madam Speaker, on behalf of the Asian and Pacific Islander Legislative Caucus, I rise in strong support of ACR 54 to establish California Holocaust Memorial Day. In the darkest moment of the 20th century, Hitler led a genocide that resulted in the senseless death of 11 million individuals, which does not account also for all the post-traumatic impacts and the potential suicides and deaths that are not accounted for. This resolution ensures that our future generations will have an opportunity to learn about this blight in our world history. We need to learn this history so that we can ensure that something like the Holocaust never happens again. This day is also about recognizing the strength and courage needed to fight against injustice. Jewish American organizations played a significant role as coalition partners with Japanese American organizations in advocating for redress for Japanese American internment. This weekend's violent shooting at a synagogue in Poway is a tragic and urgent reminder that we must not keep silent in the face of bigotry and hatred. We must stand united across all faiths and backgrounds and work together by speaking up for peace. Please join me in voting aye on this resolution so that we can reflect on the lives of those lost in World War II. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nazarian. Mr. Gloria, you are recognized on this resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the California Legislative LGBTQ Caucus in support of ACR 54. Today we remember those whose lives were lost during the Holocaust and honor those who survived this heinous attempt at extermination. Many groups, as you may know, were targeted and persecuted in the Holocaust alongside the Jewish community. That, of course, unfortunately includes our LGBT community. Hitler saw these innocent people as a threat to what he believed was the superior race. Nazis targeted gay men because they believed that they were, quote, unfit to defend the nation in combat and would diminish German reproductive potential. Even in concentration camps, LGBTQ inmates were kept in separate facilities for fear that homosexuality would spread to other prisoners. Rudolf Brazda was one such survivor. He was at Buchenwald. He was pink triangle number 7952. And he wore that pink triangle until his liberation by U.S. Armed Forces in 1945. When he passed away in 2011, Brazda was the last known survivor to wear the pink triangle, the emblem that homosexuals had to wear in concentration camps. And while he made it a point throughout his life to share his story and the story of LGBTQ victims of the Nazis and the survivors of all the survivors of the Holocaust, we know that unfortunately sometimes these stories are omitted from Holocaust literature and education. This exclusion is, of course, the natural evolution of global homophobia. But as my colleague noted, it is also part of a greater anti-Semitic effort to erase this dark history, part of our human history from the history books. We must spread Rudolph's story and all of those who were persecuted in the Holocaust, especially those folks whose names will never be known, whose faces and stories we may never be able to tell. It is in that spirit that our LGBTQ caucus has chosen to reclaim and to lift up the pink triangle, not as the symbol that Adolf Hitler meant it to be, but as a symbol of the perseverance of people who would not go quietly. As we acknowledge the Holocaust as a time in our history, we must recognize, of course, that hate is still alive and so very present in our modern day society. As a member of the San Diego legislative delegation, many of us were horrified and angered by the actions of a lone individual this past Saturday in our home county, whose sole purpose was to kill people because they were Jewish. This is a moment that should cause all of us to pause and recognize that we're not talking simply about something that happened in the past, but something that we must battle every single day with everything that we have. Lives are at stake, members. Above all, today, the California LGBTQ caucus stands in solidarity with our fellow caucus and the Jewish caucus. And we will rise up and we will fight against anyone who claims that their identity is superior. And of course, we will be for a free and equitable and safe society for all of us. Our caucus urges you all to vote in favor of ACR 54. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Gloria. Ms. Friedman, you are recognized on this resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today on behalf of the California Legislative Women's Caucus in support of ACR 54. And let me say what an honor it is to have so many survivors on the floor with us today. It's wonderful to have you all here. Thank you. Of the millions that perished during the Holocaust, women were subjected to some of the most inhumane treatment. Mothers were separated from their children and families, and mothers were often marched into the gas chambers with their children. And remember that at the time, most of the people who were sent to the concentration camps knew full well the fate that was going to await them. They knew that they were going to their death. Imagine being one of those women having to march into a gas chamber with your children and then to have to watch them succumb to the gases before you too met your death. I can't think of anything more horrifying as a mother myself. Jewish and Gypsy women were often raped and tortured by Nazis and were subjected to horrific experiments that, if they survived, left them sterile and disfigured. Yesterday, members of the Jewish caucus and myself amongst them had the privilege of sitting down in a round table with a group of Holocaust survivors. I got to meet a woman named Renee Firestone, who was 20 years old when, along with her parents, she was sent by cattle car to Auschwitz. Now, her 14-year-old sister was one of those who was subjected to incredibly cruel and inhumane medical experiments and then executed by the Nazis. Renee herself somehow survived miraculously, but she didn't just survive, she went on to become one of the most influential fashion designers of the 20th century. She thrived. And to me, one of the great lessons of the Holocaust is one of survival and of success after surviving. And that shows that everything that Hitler did was proven to be a great failure, a failure for his nation, a failure for those who followed him, to their great shame, a failure to Germany that still lives on. But those who survived were able to continue, rebuild, even though they were scattered throughout the world. And I think it's that survival that so many of us draw inspiration from today. You know, I want to mention, too, as a Jew, one thing that I think is not often obvious to people who are not Jewish. In my family, we have survivors in my family, and my grandfather's family, the entire family tree was wiped out. Only a few people survived. But many of us only have Judaism as the core of our identity. I only recently found out that I have family from Latvia. Those roots were wiped away for so many of us, and those family stories. My grandparents and many of their generation refused to speak about experiences that they had. We're only learning about that now from survivors who are willing to speak and who are willing to come forward and give oral histories and talk about what happened to them. Most of my family's history is lost. It's lost to time. I don't even know where in the world they come from. And we're just trying to put all of that back together again, and we'll never know most of those stories. So I personally want to thank the survivors who are giving their voices to bring that history back to life for so many of us. For people like myself, we have just those fragments to cling to. So you're giving us a gift when you share our collective history. So thank you. And I do want to just talk about the role that so many women played in saving lives in World War II and in the Holocaust, liberating prisoners, fighting for the resistance, hiding those behind, and now voicing that history. There were heroic women like Hannah Shenesh, who joined the British Army in order to rescue people. 37 Jews, including Hannah, imagine being a young girl without training, parachuting into occupied areas to free prisoners. Hannah was eventually captured and murdered by the Nazis, a fate that I'm sure that she knew she faced, but it was so important to her to save other lives that she sacrificed herself. I have a neighbor named Krista Miller, who some of you had the honor of meeting a couple of years ago when I brought her up here on Holocaust Day. Krista, her father was a prominent SS officer and Nazi. Her uncle, Klaus von Stauffenberg, was one of the engineers of the failed assassination attempt against Hitler. Krista and her family, now her parents were executed for their part in the attempt, but Krista and her family were sent to a traitors' camp in the concentration camps with the children of other traitors of the Nazis. She survived to tell her story and the story of her parents. Today, we pay tribute to all of those heroes and the roles that they had in one of the darkest chapters of history. We honor their sacrifice, their spirit and their strength, their perseverance and their bravery and their leadership, and we carry the light with us today as we continue to fight for equality, justice, and peace. I urge all of you to vote for ACR 54. I thank my colleague from the San Gabriel Valley for bringing this forward and for all of you for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Friedman. Mr. Gabriel, you may close on this resolution.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I just first want to say thank you to all my colleagues and the caucuses for your support and for your really beautiful words. As many of you know, Jews are a tiny minority. We make up less than 0.25% of the world's population. As I've shared with many of you, there are more Latinos in the state of California than Jews in the world. And so it is deeply meaningful for us to have your support and your solidarity on this resolution and during this difficult time for our community. As my colleague from Glendale mentioned in her beautiful remarks, a number of us were fortunate yesterday to sit down and meet with some survivors of the Holocaust. And I had the opportunity to meet a really special woman by the name of Ava Nathanson. She's an artist who has worked with gang-involved youth in Los Angeles, and she's a child survivor of the Holocaust. And she shared with me her story. She's a Hungarian Jew by birth. At the end of the war in the December of 1944 and January of 1945, the Nazis were racing against the clock to kill as many Jews as they could before the war was over. The writing was on the wall, but they were still pushing forward with their campaign of extermination. And so in a number of days, the Nazis and their Hungarian collaborators executed about 20,000 Jews by shooting them and pushing them into the Danube River. And the way that they did this most efficiently in order to save bullets was to tie 3 people together. So they would tie 3 people together and they would shoot one of them and push them into the river, and then that person would drag down all 3 of them and they would drown. And so Ava, as a 4.5-year-old girl, found herself on the banks of the Danube, tied to her mother and tied to another 4-year-old girl. And what happened at that moment in time is that the Hungarian marksman who was executing folks recognized them as someone from the community that he knew. And so he came over to the mother and he whispered, I know that the war is almost over and I'm going to need someone to stand up and testify on my behalf and help save me when the war is over. So if you're willing to do that, then I won't kill you right now. I'll shoot you, but I'll shoot not to kill. And so, of course, on the spot, Ava's mom accepted that deal. The marksman shot her in the arm. They were pushed into the river. And they lay on the banks of the river for several hours until the executions finished. The river was choked with bodies. And then they snuck away. And Ava survived the war. She is a miracle. And every one of the survivors that are with us today are a miracle. And so on their behalf and in recognition of them, I respectfully request and I vote on ACR 54.
Thank you, Mr. Gabriel. Do you want the first roll to be open for co-authors?
Yes, please.
Okay, Mr. Gabriel is asking that the first roll be open for co-authors. The clerk will open the roll. This vote is for co-authors. This vote is for co-authors. This vote is for co-authors. The clerk will close the roll. There are 75 co-authors on ACR 54. Without objection, we'll take a voice vote on this resolution. All in favor, aye. All opposed, no. This resolution is adopted. Today, it's more important than ever to reflect on the lessons of the Holocaust that we have just discussed. This weekend here in California at the Poway Chabad, Jewish worshipers were attacked during their Sabbath celebration. A woman died while merely trying to participate in Jewish worship. It was 6 months to the day since the attack at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh that left 11 dead, the deadliest attack on Jews in United States history. There is no more important voice in this reflection than the voices of those who survived the horrors of the Holocaust. This small group endured against all odds and were the ultimate witnesses to hatred and the human brutality that can stem from it. They are the living embodiment of the triumph of the human spirit over hatred and evil. In an effort to elevate their voices, the California Legislative Jewish Caucus and the Democratic Office of Communications have prepared a short film in collaboration with the Shoah Foundation, the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Please dim the lights and begin the video. Anti-Semitism is on the rise.
I mean, I never kidded myself that anti-Semitism stopped.
There has been a major increase in hate crimes targeting the Jewish community. Whether it is hate or dangerous ignorance, the parallels to the past are striking.
Jews will not replace us!
According to sources that are telling us at least 4 dead now in this shooting taking place in this place of worship.
The suspect in today's mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh had an extensive anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish digital footprint.
San Fernando Valley Synagogue targeted by hate. The LAPD is investigating a case of anti-Semitic vandalism at a Tarzana synagogue.
Another lesson for those high school students who lined up red cups in the shape of a swastika, then posted for pictures at a party and did Nazi salutes.
I lived in the United States 60 years, and this is the first time in my life that I have actually been afraid for my future and my children's and grandchildren's future.
Less than 75 years after the Holocaust, Nazis march openly and proudly in the streets of a major U.S. city. As we reflect on current events, it is important to remember that the Holocaust didn't happen overnight.
My parents and a lot of other of that generation tried to ignore it. They said, oh, this isn't going to last. This man is crazy. It's not going to last. Well, they were wrong.
You have to understand that the Nazis were using psychology on us. Little by little, they did that, you see, so we wouldn't resist them.
Little by little, discrimination and hatred grew until an educated and modern society ultimately embraced the effort to erase the Jewish people.
You could not go into a public place, no restaurants, no swimming pools, no movies, nothing. You were not allowed in any public place anymore. And the people that you knew wouldn't talk to you anymore. Friends that you had, they would shun you, most of them. Not because they hated us all of a sudden, but they were all afraid because that was the way it was. You talk to a Jew and you'll be punished.
So they wrote that all the Jews have to move into this area within 1 week. We knew that they have an order, we have to obey it. So children were dying on the street, parents were sitting and crying. We went in cattle cars and very crowded, and mothers was crying, babies, people dying. It didn't get anything to eat. It was very scary because if we didn't know where we were going, but my dad at one point came to me, and he says, where we're going, it's not so good. I don't think we'll see each other after that anymore. We got our first tattoo. No more name, but we had to remember the number.
With anti-Semitism a growing presence in our communities today, we cannot ignore the lessons of the past.
It is time for people to recognize that the world is made out of many, many different people. Different colors, different sizes, and all kinds of differences. That is about time that we recognize that. It's about time that we learn to live with it. And one way to learn to live with it is that, and it is about time for that we start to learn about each other.
I think that by educating the people, it will help them to understand that we Jews are the same as everybody else.
We must stand up together to confront anti-Semitism and hatred of all forms.
Dehumanizing people is the first step on inviting violence like the Nazism, and we have to do our share. And that's the part that is the most difficult, to get people to realize it's very easy to dehumanize.
Don't hate. Don't ever hate each other. Let's start by hating. Try to understand each other. And if you cannot love each other, at least respect each other.
The message that we have about the Holocaust is a universal message now. For all the things that are going on in the world. The Holocaust was a blueprint on so many things that are going on today.
To mark Holocaust Memorial Day, the members of the Jewish Legislative Caucus and members of this body have invited 10 survivors to join us. We extended to them the privilege of the floor, and our honorees are seated at the desks of the members who represent them. As your name is read, please stand at your seat if you are able. Members and guests, please hold your applause. After all of our guests have been introduced, we will salute our guests. The clerk will read.
At the desk of Assemblymember Bloom is Joshua Kaufman, a survivor. Joshua Kaufman survived Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Death March, Dachau, and Waldorf concentration camps. He emigrated to Israel in 1949 and fought in the Yom Kippur War. At the desk of Assemblymember Levine is Regina Hirsch, a survivor. Regina Hirsch lived in the Lodz ghetto before being deported to Auschwitz as part of the final liquidation. She and her two sisters were transferred to Theresienstadt, where they were liberated. At the desk of Assemblymember Limon is Josie Levy-Martin, a survivor. Josie Levy-Martin survived World War II by hiding in a Catholic school in France. Her book, Never Tell Your Name, tells the story of growing up as a hidden child. At the desk of Assemblymember Lowe is Max R. Garcia, a survivor. Max R. Garcia went into hiding in Amsterdam, but was found and arrested by the Nazis. He survived Auschwitz, the Death March, the death train to Mauthausen concentration camp, and Milk concentration camp. At the desk of Assemblymember Medina is Leah Radziner, a survivor. Leah Radziner was born in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, the day after Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. She was rescued by a Christian family. At the desk of Assemblymember Nazarian is Ruth Mailer, a survivor. Ruth Mailer is Regina's older sister. Of 11 children, only her and 2 sisters survived. They went through the Lodz ghetto, Auschwitz, and Theresienstadt together. At the desk of Assemblymember Rubio is Jerry Weiser, a survivor. As an infant in 1941, Jerry was smuggled out of the Bratislava ghetto and went to live with a farmer's family in the hills outside of Bratislava. After the war, his mother found him and he moved to Israel. Unable to attend today is the guest of Assemblymember David Chu, a survivor. Tobo Weiss survived 2 ghettos and 6 concentration camps, including Auschwitz-Birkenau and Stutthof. At the war's end, Russian liberators prevented Nazis from shooting her and her fellow prisoners. Also unable to attend today is the guest of Assemblymember Friedman, Dr. Avraham Perlmutter, a survivor. Dr. Avraham Perlmutter was on the kinder transport of Jewish children from Austria to the Netherlands. The Dutch resistance hid him in various places, and he escaped 2 Nazi sieges. He wrote an autobiography about his journey. And also unable to attend today is the guest of Assembly members Gabriel and Berman, Paula Leibowicz, a survivor. Paula Leibowicz lived in a Polish ghetto before being sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. She was liberated by the Soviets and lived in a displaced persons camp in Germany for 6 years.
Members and guests, I want to thank our guests for being here with us today and helping us remember this important event. Please join me in an auditory salute to our very special guests and their families. You may be seated.
Mr. Gabriel, you are recognized at your desk for your guest introductions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have quite a few special guests with us today from across the state of California that we'd like to welcome. So I'll introduce all of them and ask that you hold your applause till the end. We're very pleased to have with us the Consul General of Israel to the Pacific Northwest, Shlomi Kaufman, and also in the back of the chamber, Stephen Smith, the Executive Director of the Shoah Foundation. We also have a large contingent of clergy and Jewish community leaders, including from the Jewish Public Affairs Committee, the Israeli American Council, the Oshman Family JCC, the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, Agudat Israel of California, the Shalom Institute, Camp Hess Kramer, the Central Valley Holocaust Educators Network, the Sacramento Jewish Federation, UC Berkeley Hillel, Daniel Pearl High School, Ben the Ark, the Jewish Center for Justice, the David Lavrosky Project, the Religious Action Center, and a large group from the Real Estate and Construction Division of the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles. Please join me in welcoming them to the Assembly chambers. Also, Mr. Speaker, I think it's appropriate to note that we are joined today. Many of those in attendance are the children and the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors and the ultimate symbol of the resiliency and perseverance of the Jewish people. So we are delighted not only to have the survivors, but also their children and grandchildren with us today. Wanted to extend an invite on behalf of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus to all of the members who are having a reception at 3 p.m. at 1201 K Street on the 15th floor. And also wanted to invite members and members of the Capitol community to visit room 115. The USC Shoah Foundation has some of their latest technology called Dimensions and Testimony. And there's actually an opportunity to interact with a virtual survivor named Pinchas Guder. He has about 30 hours of testimony that they've recorded, and you can go and interact with him. I did it earlier today. It's quite remarkable. Ask him questions about his story and his life and hear his story, and it's a very powerful thing. So we wanted to invite members to join us for that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Gabriel. And I would also like to note that a former member of this assembly, the Honorable Jackie Goldberg, has joined us today. Let's welcome her. Members, we have a special adjournment in memory for Holocaust Memorial Day. Ms. Bauer-Cahan, you are recognized at your desk for your adjournment in memory.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to adjourn in the memory of Catherine Bauer. Catherine was born on March 20th, 1921 in Vienna, Austria. She was raised surrounded by the love of her parents and her grandmother. Her father owned a hardware store, and her dog was her most beloved companion. She was an excellent student, took dance classes, and played tennis in her free time. It was on the tennis court that she would meet her childhood sweetheart, Herbert. It was a charmed life until 1939. In 1939, Austria was annexed into Nazi Germany, and Catherine was kicked out of school and excluded from all the activities that she had loved. On Kristallnacht, her mother took her and her father to the theater so that they wouldn't be home when the Nazis came for the boys and men. This spared Catherine's father from transport, although her beloved Herbert's father was taken to Dachau. They were Viennese through and through. It was the only home they'd ever known, but her mother knew they had to get out. In late 1939, Catherine's parents sent her to England to work as a live-in so that she would be saved from the fate that was to await so many others, so that she would escape Jewish extinction. Catherine would later say that the hardest day of her life was the day she left behind her grandmother and her dog, knowing she would never see them again. She was right. Her grandmother would not survive the Holocaust. In the months that followed, her mother was able to find a sponsor in New York who would give them all a second chance at life here in the United States. In 1940, she boarded a boat by herself to New York Harbor with nothing but dreams of what this second chapter of her life would look like. She liked to be called a survivor, not a refugee. In Brooklyn, she started over, working as a housekeeper to pay rent on their small apartment. She soon learned that Herbert, who had fled separately, had also made it to New York. She found him and proposed marriage, saying that if they found each other, it must be meant to be. In 1942, they were married, and in 1944, they had their first child, Robert Bauer, who would later be joined by his sister, Susan. Herbert, who started out working in the factory of the man who had sponsored his family, worked his way up to regional salesman, and in 1953, they moved to Dallas, where Catherine would spend the rest of her life. She never forgot that this country gave her a second chance at life. One of her favorite phrases was, "Excuse me, America." She wanted America to know she was here. She loved Sinatra, The Young and the Restless, and Vegas. She was really good at investing, shopping, and bridge. She was also a consummate volunteer, working to give back to this country and her community. She was president of the National Council of Jewish Women, president of the Girl Scouts of Northeast Texas, and sat on the boards of the United Way, the Dallas Holocaust Museum, the Texas State Mental Health Association, and Temple Emmanuel in Dallas. She was a founder of the Alzheimer's Association of Dallas and Literacy Instruction of Texas. One of her greatest honors was being selected to sit on a grand jury in Dallas. She's survived by 6 grandchildren and 14 great-grandchildren. She loved to cavil about the accomplishments of her children and grandchildren, many of whom have followed her in giving back to this country that gave this family a chance to survive and to thrive. Catherine was never able to finish high school because she was expelled by the Nazis, but her son earned a PhD in physics from Stanford and became one of Silicon Valley's founders. And in November, she got to celebrate her granddaughter becoming a California State Assembly member. She died on February 7, 2019, at almost 98 years old. She was blessed with 2 lives, as she would say, and a long, long life at that. I rise to adjourn in my grandmother's memory, but I also rise to adjourn in the memory of the 6 million Jews, 250,000 homosexuals, and millions of others who perished in the Holocaust, who never got to have children or grandchildren, who could rise today and adjourn in their memory. My family were the fortunate ones that got that second chance at life. Zecher Tzadik Livracha, may the memory of the righteous abide for a blessing.
Ms. Bauer-Cahan, on behalf of the members of the Assembly, please accept our sincerest condolences on the loss of your grandmother. At this time, I invite Rabbi Wise to return to the rostrum and deliver the mourner's Kaddish.
Please rise if you are able. Yit Gadal v'yit Kadash, Shemei Rabbah. Be'alma divrach yirutei, v'yamlich malchutei. B'chayechon uv'yomechon, uv'chayei dechol beit Yisrael. Balgala uv'izman kariv, v'imru. Amen. Yehe Shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam u'almei almaya. Yit barach v'yishtabach v'yit ba'ar v'yit romam v'yit naseh. V'yit hadar v'yit aleh v'yit halal Shmei dekudashah brichu. Yehe Shlama Rabbah min Shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru. Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru, amen. May the one who make peace in high places. And we all say together, amen.
Members and guests are encouraged to visit the Interact with a Virtual Holocaust Survivor exhibit in room 115 of the State Capitol until 5 p.m. today. Additionally, members are invited to attend a reception that begins at 3 p.m. at 1201 K Street on the 15th floor. On behalf of Assemblymember Gabriel and the members of the Jewish Legislative Caucus, we extend our appreciation to you for assisting us in our efforts to help future generations never forget. This concludes our ceremony. We will take a brief recess to allow our guests to depart from the chamber. Members, please do not leave the chamber. We have other business on file.